Late spring, 1945. The war is almost over, but the air in the small German village still carries the weight of months of terror. Smoke drifts in thin, tired ribbons across the rooftops, remnants of distant artillery that have finally fallen silent. The ground is scattered with shattered glass, broken wood, and the quiet aftermath of collapse. 2 U.S. soldiers move carefully through the debris of a damaged house, their uniforms streaked with dust. From the darkness of a ruined basement, they lift an unconscious German woman, her face pale beneath the settling ash. Their boots crunch steadily with each step, a calm, deliberate rhythm against the chaos around them. At the doorway stands her daughter, no older than 8. Wide-eyed. Trembling. She grips the frame as if the world might slip away again. Her voice breaks the silence. "Warum tragt her mean mother? Why are you carrying my mother?" The answer begins in the world unfolding beyond this moment. By the final months of the Second World War in Europe, the German Reich was collapsing on every front. After the Rhine crossings in March 1945, the U.S. Army moved deeper into the heart of Germany with a speed and scale the remaining German leadership could no longer counter. What had once been organized defensive lines now broke into scattered pockets of resistance, often manned by exhausted troops, militia units, or youths pressed into service during the final weeks. For civilians, the collapse came with devastating consequences. Towns lay shredded by months of Allied bombing and artillery fire. Rail lines no longer functioned, food distribution had disintegrated, and medical care, once already strained, was nearly non-existent. Hunger became a daily reality. Families searched for water, firewood, and the few remaining edible crops in abandoned fields. Mothers carried their children across ruined streets, hoping to find shelter that had not yet been swallowed by the fighting. Millions of civilians were on the move. Elderly couples pushing handcarts, widows leading children by the hand, and families with all their belongings tied into cloth bundles. Entire communities displaced not only by the advancing Allied forces, but by the destruction of their own infrastructure. Many fled from one ruined town to another, seeking safety that no longer existed in any direction. The collapse of the Nazi administrative structure deepened the chaos. Local officials disappeared, military police had long abandoned their posts, and the systems that once controlled the civilian population were falling apart. In many villages, no one knew who was in charge. Orders came too late or never arrived. Rumors replaced information, and fear became a universal language. As U.S. units pushed forward, encounters between American troops and German civilians became more frequent. These were not the uniformed soldiers the Americans had fought in Normandy or the Ardennes. These were families, farmers, refugees, and the wounded. For the first time, large numbers of civilians approached American lines not as enemies but as desperate survivors seeking safety, food, or medical assistance. The U.S. military had prepared for such situations. Manuals and briefings instructed soldiers to treat civilians humanely, maintain order, and prevent reprisals. Military police units were assigned to manage newly surrendered areas, while civil affairs officers attempted to re-establish basic services. The Army understood that stability could not return without protecting those caught in the middle of the conflict. Yet every village had its own story, shaped by the destruction around it. And in one such village, broken walls, collapsed roofs, and smoke drifting through empty streets, a young girl would soon witness a moment that stood out sharply against the ruins of war. Inside Germany's bomb-damaged villages, daily life in 1945 had become a fragile balance between survival and uncertainty. Homes that once sheltered generations now stood with their walls cracked open, rooftops torn away, and basements filled with rubble from nearby explosions. The winter had passed, but the cold lingered in the stone floors and damp cellars where families huddled during air raids. Food cellars were empty. Wells were contaminated. And every street carried the scars of a war that had come too close. German civilians lived under the constant weight of propaganda that had warned for years that enemy soldiers would bring brutality, revenge, and destruction. Many believed it. Mothers hid their daughters. Families avoided the roads. Children were taught to run from approaching foreign troops. Even as the Reich collapsed, the fear persisted, fear of being judged for the uniforms their fathers wore, or for the flags that once hung from their windows. But when American troops entered these towns, their conduct often contrasted sharply with the terrifying rumors. The U.S. Army operated under the rules of war, with strict orders regarding the treatment of civilians. Soldiers were told to avoid unnecessary force, protect non-combatants, and provide immediate assistance when possible. Medical corps units followed closely behind frontline troops, establishing aid stations to treat both soldiers and civilians caught in the destruction. In many cases, German women inadvertently became accidental POWs. The term was informal but common. Civilians found near active combat zones were temporarily detained to ensure security. Others were taken into custody simply because they were discovered in areas where German troops had recently surrendered. Some followed retreating soldiers to seek safety, only to be mistaken for auxiliaries or support personnel. Identification was often unclear, documents lost, buildings destroyed, officials gone. Amid this uncertainty, women were frequently pulled into the vast flow of displaced people being processed by U.S. units. Some were questioned, others redirected to safer areas, and many were given basic medical care after weeks without treatment. Children accompanying them were rarely separated but lived through the same confusion and fear. It was in this environment, where rumor clashed with reality, and destruction overshadowed every familiar landmark, that the mother and daughter from our opening scene found themselves struggling to survive. Their home, damaged by repeated shelling, had become too dangerous to live in, yet it was the only shelter they had left. The basement, once a safe refuge during air raids, had turned into a trap when part of the structure collapsed. And when American soldiers entered their village shortly after the fighting stopped, they expected to find military stragglers or abandoned weapons, not a frightened child and her injured mother buried beneath debris. The moment that followed would challenge everything the young girl had been taught to fear. The human angle. For German civilians, the final months of the war carved deep into both body and spirit. Years of rationing had worn families thin, but 1945 brought something harsher: true starvation. Bread was stretched with sawdust, potatoes were traded like currency, and many days passed with nothing more than watery soup. Children grew gaunt. Mothers hid their hunger so their sons and daughters could eat. Sleep came in brief moments, broken by the thud of artillery, the wail of sirens, or the dread of what the next day might bring. Fear was not occasional, it was a constant companion. And exhaustion had become the quiet language spoken by nearly every face in the villages now collapsing under the weight of defeat. The U.S. soldier angle. For young American soldiers, the advance into Germany presented a different reality from the battles they had trained for. Many had entered the war expecting relentless enemy resistance, and prepared themselves mentally for street-by-street combat. Instead, they found towns filled with civilians who were more afraid of them than of the war still burning on the horizon. These soldiers, some barely older than the children they encountered, carried the memory of lost friends from Normandy, the Hürtgen Forest, and the Ardennes. Yet as they faced starving families and frightened women, their training collided with something more human. They had come expecting an enemy; instead, they found shattered households and people desperate for help. The shift was immediate and disorienting. The medical and logistical angle. Behind the frontline units, American Medical Corps teams worked tirelessly to provide emergency aid. They had protocols for dealing with battlefield casualties, but in Germany many of their patients became civilians caught between collapsing buildings or fires sparked by shelling. Field medics moved rapidly with their kits: morphine syringes, bandages, sulfa powder, and improvised splints. They treated wounds caused not only by bullets but by falling masonry, burns, and weeks of untreated illness. Logistics units followed, distributing food, securing clean water sources, and marking unsafe buildings. Every assessment required judgment: who needed immediate care, who could walk, who was missing, who was in danger below unstable structures. Villages were evaluated house by house, cellar by cellar. And each discovery reminded the soldiers that war did not end when the fighting moved on, it lingered in every crushed home and silent room. These realities formed the landscape in which one girl stood watching two foreign soldiers carry her injured mother into the light. The moral and contrast angle. For the American soldiers entering Germany, the war had been defined by months of deadly combat, grim discoveries in liberated territories, and the weight of fighting an enemy regime responsible for immense destruction. Yet on the ground, when met with civilians, especially women and children, their actions often reflected a stark moral contrast to the brutality they had been warned to expect in return. Training emphasized discipline, but humanity guided many decisions in these final months. Soldiers who had seen the worst of the conflict found themselves offering bread, water, or medical aid to families who moments earlier had feared the sound of their boots. In moments like the rescue of the unconscious German mother, compassion became an instinct stronger than caution. It was not about politics or victory, it was about seeing suffering and choosing to stop it. The enemy familiarity angle. As the Americans moved deeper into the German countryside, many experienced a subtle but profound shift in perception. The people they encountered did not resemble the ideological enemy portrayed in wartime briefings. They were farmers, seamstresses, laborers, and children, people whose lives had been swept into the war rather than shaped by it. Soldiers noticed families praying in damaged churches, women carrying water from streams, and children clutching makeshift toys carved from scrap wood. These were not combatants, they were neighbors caught on the wrong side of a vast conflict. The realization softened their approach. It was easier to lower a rifle when facing someone who looked like a cousin, sister, or younger sibling back home. The line between enemy territory and village in distress blurred quickly. The psychological angle. For the children of wartime Germany, the psychological weight was overwhelming. They had grown up under propaganda warning them of invaders who would harm them. Every distant explosion carried the threat of loss. Every airplane overhead could bring death. When the fighting finally reached their streets, they clung to whatever shelter they could find. The little girl who watched the Americans carry her mother was shaped by this constant fear. In her mind, enemy soldiers were not rescuers, they were the figures spoken of in terrifying whispers. Her confusion at the sight of their compassion was immediate and raw. She expected punishment, violence, or separation. Instead, she saw strangers lifting her mother gently, speaking softly, and working quickly to save her life. The moment shattered the emotional walls that fear had built around her. It created a memory that would outlast the war itself. These angles, moral, familiar, psychological, converge in the pivotal moment when compassion confronted fear inside a ruined German home. The collapse came without warning. A single artillery shell, fired hours earlier during the final exchange on the outskirts of the village, had weakened the structure of the family's home. When the front doors slammed shut in the wind, the vibration traveled through already damaged beams. The basement ceiling, cracked and sagging, gave way in a sudden roar of splintering wood and falling stone. Dust filled the air like smoke. The mother had been reaching for a crate of stored potatoes when the floor above her gave in. Heavy boards struck her shoulder and head, knocking her unconscious. The child, standing near the stairwell, screamed as debris tumbled dangerously close to her feet. She rushed down the steps, coughing, calling out to her mother through the thick gray haze. Minutes later, though it felt much longer, the distant hum of engines and the sharp voices of American soldiers echoed through the street. A patrol had entered the village to check for stragglers and assess damages. One soldier paused, hearing a faint, panicked cry through the broken windows. "Medic! Someone's inside!" They approached cautiously, knowing unstable buildings were as dangerous as any ambush. The doorway hung crooked on its hinges. The floor creaked beneath their boots. Dust drifted from the ceiling with each careful step. Then they heard it clearly, a child's voice calling for help. Flashlights cut through the dim interior. They found the staircase partially blocked, boards twisted at odd angles. One soldier tested the top step. It groaned ominously but held. They descended slowly, eyes scanning for further collapse. In the cramped basement, they saw the girl crouched beside her mother, trying to clear debris far too heavy for her small hands. The soldiers exchanged a quick, silent calculation. The ceiling above them could give way without notice. One more shift, one wrong move, and the floor might trap them all. But hesitation cost lives, and the mother's shallow breathing meant time was running out. One soldier braced himself against a leaning support beam. The other began lifting the broken boards piece by piece, ignoring the dust that stung his eyes and the dull ache in his arms. The girl watched, trembling, unsure whether these men were rescuers or enemies fulfilling the frightening tales she had grown up hearing. With each removed plank, the mother's face became more visible, blood at her temple, ash in her hair, clothing torn by the force of the collapse. Finally, the soldiers managed to lift her from the rubble. Working with practiced coordination, they carried her toward the stairway. At the top of the steps, light poured into the ruined entryway. The girl followed closely behind, clinging to the banister for balance. When the soldiers stepped into the open air, carrying her unconscious mother, the child found herself overwhelmed. Fear, confusion, and disbelief surged all at once. Her voice broke through the echo of crunching glass beneath their boots. "Worm tragged her, mean mudder? Why are you carrying my mother?" The question hung in the air, raw, frightened, and defining, marking the exact moment the war's dividing lines began to shift for her. The soldiers did not answer immediately. There was no rehearsed response for a question like hers. Instead, one of them motioned gently for the girl to follow as they stepped into the clearer light outside the ruined home. The village square, though damaged, offered enough space to set the injured woman down safely. A medic on the patrol hurried forward, kneeling beside her as soon as the soldiers lowered her onto a blanket spread across the ground. He moved quickly, checking her pulse, clearing dust from her airway, examining the wound on her temple. The girl watched every motion with silent terror. She had never seen American soldiers up close before. Their uniforms, their helmets, the foreign accents, everything felt unreal. But the medic's hands were steady and careful, nothing like the violence she had been warned about. He signaled for his bag. Another soldier handed it over. Out came bandages, cotton pads, a small tin of sulfa powder, and a canteen of clean water. The medic cleaned the wound, speaking softly to his patient even though she was unconscious. He tilted her head to keep her airway open, then wrapped gauze around her injury with precise, practiced movements. The girl edged closer. She wanted to touch her mother but didn't yet trust that it was allowed. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the men talking. Every breath felt tight, caught between panic and fragile hope. One of the soldiers noticed her trembling and crouched down to her level. He didn't reach out, he simply met her gaze and nodded slowly, as if to say she wasn't in danger. His restraint mattered more than any words could. It was the first moment her fear wavered. Nearby, the medic opened a morphine syringe but hesitated. The woman's breathing had stabilized enough that pain relief could wait until she regained consciousness. Instead, he gave her a small amount of water along her lips and checked her pulse again, stronger now, more responsive. The girl finally knelt beside her mother. Seeing no objection from the soldiers, she gently took her mother's hand. Her eyes filled with tears as relief mingled with confusion. Everything she had been told about enemy soldiers had prepared her for cruelty, not this quiet competence, not this calm urgency to help someone they had never met. A soft breeze moved through the village square, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and spring earth. Around them, the patrol continued its work, checking buildings, guiding a few emerging civilians to safe areas, marking unstable structures. Yet for the girl, the world had narrowed to a single scene, strangers saving the most important person in her life. The mother stirred faintly. Her fingers twitched in her daughter's hand. The medic leaned in, encouraging her with gentle words, while the soldiers stepped back to give them space. And it was in that subtle distance, where the child felt neither threatened nor alone, that the transformation occurred. The uniforms no longer looked like the symbols of an enemy. They looked like the symbols of help. For the first time in her life, the girl saw the men not as foreign soldiers, but as human beings who had carried her mother out of danger when the world around them was falling apart. The mother regained consciousness in the makeshift medical area set up by the American patrol. Her injuries, bruised shoulders, a laceration across her temple, and deep abrasions from debris, were serious but not life-threatening. Within hours, she received additional care from U.S. field medics, who stabilized her condition and ensured she had food and water. Over the following days, she began the slow process of recovery, aided by both the medics and neighbors who emerged from nearby damaged homes. The presence of U.S. occupation troops introduced a new system of civilian care in areas recently liberated from conflict. Soldiers patrolled streets not to punish but to provide protection, distribute rations, and help restore order. Field hospitals were set up in churches, schools, and undamaged municipal buildings. Military engineers repaired critical infrastructure, cleared debris, and helped reconnect disrupted water and power lines. In towns like this one, such efforts were among the first tangible signs of stability. Local opinions about Americans shifted quickly. Rumors of reprisals and harsh treatment had fueled fear, but first-hand experiences of aid and rescue began to counter the narrative. Civilians observed soldiers carrying water to children, assisting the elderly with daily tasks, and treating the wounded regardless of nationality. Acts like the rescue of the young girl's mother became emblematic of this transformation. Stories of compassion spread through villages faster than the sound of artillery had months earlier, reshaping perceptions of the occupying forces. Early steps towards stabilization were modest but meaningful. Schools reopened where buildings were safe, and local councils, under American supervision, began organizing basic services. Markets returned in limited form, and displaced civilians were guided to temporary shelters. For families like the one in the village, the presence of orderly troops, medical aid, and food rations allowed them to begin rebuilding routines, however fragile, after months of fear, hunger, and uncertainty. The long-term consequences of these small acts of humanity were profound. The mother's survival allowed the daughter to carry a memory of compassion that contrasted sharply with the war's brutality. In personal narratives collected across Germany after the conflict, similar stories emerged, soldiers assisting civilians trapped in rubble, providing food to starving families, and protecting vulnerable populations from lingering combat hazards. These moments created a bridge between wartime enmity and post-war reconciliation. Post-war reconstruction relied heavily on both material aid and the rebuilding of trust. Civilians, especially children, carried the impressions of soldiers who had treated them with care and respect. These memories contributed to a gradual normalization of life and helped foster the understanding that the enemy could also be human, capable of empathy and protection. Families documented these experiences in diaries, letters, and later testimonies for post-war tribunals and oral history projects, ensuring that individual acts of kindness were preserved alongside accounts of destruction and violence. Similar cases across Germany reinforced this theme. In Cologne, Dresden, and smaller villages across the Rhineland and Bavaria, field medics rescued civilians from collapsed structures or provided urgent treatment to those unable to reach hospitals. Soldiers shared food rations, offered guidance, and in some instances, sheltered families from the continuing dangers of unexploded ordnance. These encounters, while fleeting, left lasting impressions and helped shape the post-war narrative of the American Army as disciplined yet humane. For the village where the mother and daughter lived, the incident became a quiet legend. The girl would remember it for the rest of her life. The precise moment her fear gave way to trust, the first understanding that kindness could exist even amidst chaos. It also marked the beginning of a community slowly learning to adapt to a new authority, one that did not rely on fear, but on order, care, and respect for human life. In the quiet aftermath of destruction, moments like these stand out with unexpected clarity. A child's trembling question, a mother lifted from rubble, and the calm, deliberate hands of strangers. These are the scenes that endure long after the cannons fall silent. They remind us that even at the edge of the world's deadliest conflict, human dignity can survive. War, in its vast machinery of violence, often reduces people to numbers, to positions on maps, to strategic objectives. Yet individual choices, small, decisive acts of compassion, pierce through that machinery. The soldiers who carried a German mother from her collapsed home could have walked past. They could have seen her as merely another civilian in a conquered village. Instead, they acted. Their humanity became the bridge between two worlds torn apart by ideology and destruction. This small kindness symbolized more than rescue, it symbolized hope. It signaled that even amid fear, suspicion, and years of orchestrated hatred, people could recognize shared vulnerability and respond with care. For the girl, it reshaped her understanding of the enemy. For the village, it offered a fragile yet powerful example that order, trust, and empathy could coexist with the remnants of war. Ultimately, this story is a reminder: war does not erase humanity. It tests it. And in the choices of individuals, in the courage to help, to save, to protect, humanity endures. In the rubble of a collapsing house, amidst smoke and shattered glass, it shone through, quiet but unbreakable.